Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to talk to you all today. It's interesting as I look there at my slide title, aligning special collections. I'm feeling very 20th century now after hearing Scott's talking about collections. But I think you'll find some ways that we look at collections in a little different way than sort of the traditional way as we're moving through this, but going forward. So. I do feel like this is a really timely topic because, and I think it's only going to grow in importance as demands on library services and collection content continues to expand. Actually today is my 1-year anniversary for being at Penn State as the head of the Special Collections Library. And so one of the things I've been trying to do in that first year is really sort of take a look into the various programs and the collections that we make available. And so, and this has led me to sort of try to assess where we are going with our collection development. But before I sort of delve into the collection assessment process that we're using at Penn State, I'd like to take a moment to sort of step back and talk about a little bit about why special collections has become such a hot topic in research libraries, and then also really sort of define special collections, which I really think is a moving target for us. So this is a quote that'll probably, or some variation of that'll probably be familiar to most of you, because really over the past several years, there's just been a number of reports that have really, and studies that have really focused on special collections. From OCLC's Taking Our Pulse report in 2010 to the ARL Special Collections Task Force, the concept that special collections are what makes the library distinctive has been a really repeated theme. And I think this statement from Don Waters of the Mellon Foundation captures it best. In his address to the Association of Research Libraries in the fall of 2005, Waters spoke about the growing importance of special collections. And while his talk focused primarily on strategic issues for the management of digital assets, Waters observed that as more traditional materials become available online or in electronic versions only, it will become increasingly difficult to distinguish libraries based on their holdings of these materials. Instead, libraries and their institutions will increasingly be distinguished by the special collections of rare and unique materials that they hold. And this is actually sort of the first part of the quote, and this is sort of the one that really gets that gets picked up by a lot of different other publications that have gone up. But one of the things, and this actually dovetails very well with our keynote talk today, that Waters actually goes on to say that we're going to also be distinguished by the scholarly services that we provide for these materials. And while I'm not delving as much into that part about in my talk today, you've already heard that theme come up several times today, and I think it's really a very important thing to consider. It's not just the collections, it really is the services that go along with them. So before I get into assessment, let's sort of talk about what are special collections, because one of the things I've learned, I've worked at multiple different special collections over the years, and I really have learned that what is a special collections is definitely a moving target. And so what I thought I'd do is sort of start off by talking what is special collections. So here's some examples based on my collection at Penn State that I think pretty much anybody would agree. So we have Ernest Hemingway's nephews gave us a collection of his letters and materials, and so most people would say Ernest Hemingway papers are special collections. We have the archival records of the United Steelworkers. Most people would say a labor archive of unique material is a special collection. We have William Morris's utopian novel about utopian socialist novel, News from Nowhere, which was fine press printed by the Kelmscott Press. Morris was one of the founders of the English arts and crafts movement. So even if you aren't into socialist literature or utopian literature, if you're going to find printing, most people would agree that a Kelmscott Press book is a rare book. And then finally, we have a soldier's diary up there from the Civil War. Most people would consider Civil War diaries and letters special collections. So those are sort of the easy ones. But it gets a little harder when you start looking at the individual collections. So particularly some materials really depend on your institutional context. So at Penn State, we have the papers and records of big band leader Fred Waring, who also bought the patent for a blender, which he marketed under his name, the Waring blender. And that's not a typo. He actually did it with an O. And so we actually have a collection of Waring blenders as part of his collection. I guarantee you I probably am the only special collections person here who has a Waring blender, unless you have it for your parties or something like that, in their special collection. So that was sort of, again, based on kind of context. The other thing is then, of course, the popular Hunger Games. I actually have in special collections a copy of the Hunger Games. Well, people go, there's nothing rare about that. That's a mass market book. There's got to be a gazillion copies of it out there. But again, it goes back to our utopian literature collection. The Hunger Games is a dystopian novel, and it was required for the collection as part of our collecting for the future and sort of having that representation there. And then you go further afield of things that not are traditionally considered in special collections and not really even owned or managed by special collections. But how do they fit into things? Such as like 18th century collections online, a licensed database. It really doesn't sort of fit into the normal scheme of special collections, but databases like this are often contain very complementary and overlapping material to that content that we have in special collections. And interestingly, the curator, depending on how engaged that person is with what's happening in the library, may or may not have been involved with the decision making to bring that item in, and in some cases, although hopefully not in my case, wouldn't even know that we have that item there. So it's interesting how does that impact then how we build the collection, knowing that we have this kind of content available. And then getting a sort of one level of further afield, Penn State, like many institutions, has collaborative digitization projects. So one of the things we have there is a People's Contest. It's a digitization project where the staff have gone out and looked for Civil War materials in private hands or in historical societies, digitized it, and made it freely available on the web. The library does not own the content. We make it accessible. It's very complementary to what we have in special collections. How does that inform our collections and how we're moving forward, and where does that fit into the whole scheme of things? So to help sort of put the two sort of special collections and examples into context, this next slide is sort of my personal definition of what I consider special collections, and I think it really sort of ties things a little bit better than some of those traditional definitions about how old something is, how rare something is, how unique something is, because again, it fits more into the theme of the services and things that we offer for collections. So the sort of the 5 points that I like to think of what makes us special collections is, first is that it's a place of discovery and excitement, and hopefully the entire library is that, not just the special collections of that, but it is one of the things that we should really be looking at how we, as we build our special collections and market our special collections, it should be a place that people really come in to do research and learn about materials. It should be an integral part of the library and campus. It shouldn't be this thing that stands alone and people can't understand why this collection is associated with the university. There needs to be some kind of context that sort of, so that the library and campus have a sense of ownership with the special collections library. It should be a place of innovation. When I look at what's come out of the special collections community, we were some of the earliest with digitization efforts. Special collections has been really one of the leader in born digital materials. We were some of the earliest people using XML markup for metadata. And I like to also think that we were the first embedded librarians, because many special collections back in the 30s and 40s, this really takes us back, were actually special collections that were started by academic departments on campus and then moved into the library. So I also like to think that we kind of had that sort of innovation there. We just haven't marketed it well enough. So I also like to think that we're a place of public trust. When people come to special collections, we bring in collections, we preserve them, we make them available. We're sort of there to having this unaltered, authentic record, whether it's in paper format, audio format, or digital format, available for researchers to use. So we should be really a place of public trust. And then finally, back to that place of institutional distinction. Because of all those other pieces together, including the collections, then it really makes us an area of distinction for the university. So what about alignment? So this is one of the kind of interesting questions that have come along. I've worked in a number of different special collections over the years, and sort of, actually in some places that when we named, there was almost even a kind of a feeling of pride when we weren't totally aligned with the library or campus and we had this kind of independence. And I think it is because special collections historically have been independently built. Sometimes they come out of academic departments. They have different organizational structures. Even here on this stage, you have 3 different organizational models where I'm part of the library reporting to an associate dean. Lisa is actually part of the administration of the library, and Fran actually reports directly to the provost as a totally different organization structure. So is actually not part of the main campus library. So you've got 3 different kinds of structures there. That, again, that makes that kind of alignment a little more different and challenging depending on your organizational structure. Also, special collections have a tendency to be opportunistically built. There are alumni that come forward that have collections that are just these great opportunities for coming in. There are donor connections for bringing things in. And so there's a lot of times things come in different ways to special collections that sort of may take the mission and move it a little off the course of where the main library is. So There's also that piece about making alignment challenging. The other thing is there may be dedicated and sometimes inflexible funding sources. You may have endowments that are set up, have been historically there and set up that can only be spent for certain purposes. When I was at Duke University, we actually had an endowment that could only be spent on 19th century humor publications. So, there's only so much 19th century humor out there that you can buy. And at Penn State, I have an endowment that is for the purchase of materials relating to the 8th Air Force. You get these very narrowly written endowments sometimes that have been done historically that sometimes makes it challenging if your mission changes and makes it harder for you to be flexible for realigning. So that's one of the other things that sometimes makes alignment a little challenging. The other thing, and I think this is actually a good thing, is that special collections have tried to avoid trendy collecting and supporting short-term needs. One-off collections to support specific faculty or sort of programs on campus that come and go can really become all of a sudden these sort of legacy collections that all of a sudden you have a commitment to keeping on and building when there actually is no one on your campus using it. And unless it's significant enough that it has national importance and brings distinctions to your institution, they sort of become kind of little orphan collections in there. Because one of the things in special collections, when we bring things in, we're generally in it for the long haul. This is sort of something we're not bringing in for a short-term use, we're actually bringing it in for long-term research use. And one of the things that for those of us in special collections, deaccession is hard because depending on the agreement that you've got with your donor or how you acquired it, it can be very staff time intensive to deaccession collections. So again, we have to sort of think carefully before we do some of the more kind of trendy kind of collecting. So with the definition of special collections as a background and sort of how collections are kind of built and sort of the alignment challenges, how do you approach doing an assessment of your collections and sort of looking to move forward? Well, one of the things that I did at Penn State is sort of looked at some of the materials out there. Many of us of a certain age will remember the RLG conspectus. That certainly was my introduction to how to evaluate collections and go through those 5 levels of analyzing your collection. And it's still something back in my DNA now as I think about collections. I go back to that source. But there's also a lot of other really good data to take a look at for assessing collections and moving forward. There's been a lot of great studies, as I mentioned earlier, about special collections, and sort of go through 3 of them that have kind of informed my thinking as I was going through the assessment project and looking at this talk. Many of you are familiar with the OCLC study, Taking Our Pulse, which was a follow-up study on an ARL survey of special collections. One of the piece of key data in there was that since 1998, print special collections have grown by 50% and archival collections by 300%. That's quite a staggering growth since in the period between 1998 and 2010. And so obviously the need to understand what we're collecting and why we're collecting is really important if we're growing that fast. And there are other tools that are coming out. So Marilee Profit and Martha Conway did a very interesting report just last year called Taking Stock and Making Hay, which is a collection assessment work looking mostly at sort of assessing your backlog and that kind of thing for moving forward. But they had a really interesting section as part of that report, which I would recommend to you, is like what's missing from this picture. And in that section they state, assigning a research value rating as a component of archival collections assessment is one way to estimate potential scholarly significance. Another might be mining use and other data to determine how heavily used a particular collection or group of collections might be. So again, sort of what kind of data is out there to be able to assess that. And then most recently, ARL has come out with a really interesting report on 21st century collections, and it's a fairly recent publication. But it also sort of sets the stage for why we need to be looking at special collections and how collections are built. One of the sort of the key statements in there is that budgetary issues are pushing some libraries to meet local needs of faculty and students through more limited and demand-driven acquisitions. Maintaining the broad-based selection of the past while acquiring and preserving a large corpus of unique material available locally as well as globally requires unprecedented coordination and new strategies. And so I sort of took that as a charge, as why I need to be looking at how we're building collections. So all these reports really give sort of good data sort of to looking forward about how you really might go into to analyzing your collection and looking at sort of how to align it better with the mission of the library and the campus. So I'll talk a little bit about the Penn State assessment project. One of the nice things about being the new guy on campus, and I'm still going to milk that new guy thing as long as I can, is you can go through and start create some really interesting projects. So one of the things I really wanted to do is sort of get a better grip on where our collections were going and where we had been historically and where we should be going in the future when I came there. And the Special Collections Library at Penn State sort of has an interesting history. Up until 1999, we were actually 3 separate units. There was a University Archives unit, a Historical Collections and Labor Archives unit, and a Rare Book and Manuscript units. In 1999, the three units merged to make the Eberly Family Special Collections Library. And while there certainly is a lot more coordination of collecting since the merger, sort of the basic collecting directions and assignments have remained virtually the same over that decade plus. So we were really ripe to take a look at how to go forward. So, and think about how to do that. I sort of came up with, worked with some of the staff there and some of the folks outside the library to sort of come up with a methodology, and then had a task force created and charged by the dean of the libraries. The task force is composed of 3 subject librarians, 1 non-library faculty member, the library's assessment librarian, and the director of library development. And it purposely was set up that way so that without a special collections staff person on there, so that we would really get 2 things. One is they can really sort of feel not pressured by sort of the historical trends where we've collected, but it also brings in an outside group to get more buy-in to where we're going with our collection. So so let me talk about a little bit about some of the data points that we've considered. So the data points we considered, we've looked at historical special collections strengths, and this was actually, a lot of this was gathered through documentation, but also with interviews with the curators and staff. We looked at collection use and support, and for those of you in special collections, I could do a whole separate talk about sort of the need for more consistent metrics for measuring special collections, but that has actually been one of the challenging data points in this study. But we also looked at the main library collection strengths and strategic plans, the campus strategic plans, and also looked at areas of opportunity. Where is the campus growing? Where are places that we could really develop the collection further? So the process is still going. I don't expect to get the report from the task force till the end of the summer, but we've already had several meetings, and there have actually already been some really good early results. One of which, although I said this is labor intensive, we do have now the accession policy in place so that when we do find collections out of scope, we have a process for being able to remove them. The other thing, too, is that one of the things the outside folks notice much more than the special collections folks is that even though we were merged as a special collections library, we still sort of had a much more of a unit type approach towards collecting and not a topical type approach. And so we've really tried to sort of flatten that and move away from, because the outside public, they just want the stuff. They don't really care which former historic unit has collected it. So that's been another really good thing that's happened. The other thing they're doing is they're trying to find the gaps. Where are the areas where more development could happen, where the main library is strong but special collections not, and is that an appropriate fit for us to build? So that's identifying those new opportunities. But one of the greatest benefits, I think, has been the greater transparency about what special collections holds and what we're doing. Even though stuff has been in the catalog and we've had websites and like that, the buy-in from the subject librarians and other folks who've been worked in this process has been really great, and we really plan to widely disseminate the findings and share it broadly with the library and campus when we're done. And I think that also helps with, we want to have more ownership of the directions and services that special collections offers than just the special collections staff. So that's been one of the real benefits from this. So to wrap things in, what are the benefits of closer alignment? And first, I'll add this disclaimer. Just as no 2 special collections are alike, we're just like snowflakes. Your results may vary. Your results may vary if you decide to pursue an assessment project like this. But some of the tangible benefits I want to go forward. So one, I just sort of touched on it. There's a greater understanding and support of the special collections collecting policy by having that broader level of involvement. The other thing that comes out of this, too, is there's more potential for integrated services and engagement from librarians outside of special collections. We've already looked in and having some of the subject librarian specialists help us process collections where we don't have expertise inside special collections. But we've also talked further about is there more opportunity for reference service exchange and instruction exchange, and trying to bring more integration in those areas with special collections. So it goes beyond just the collection level to those kind of services we do. The other benefit, I think, is more focused collections with greater support from campus will add more to our distinctiveness. That word, I think, now is at least the 5th time I've used that in the talk, and probably it'll be the 200th time today or something like that. But it is one of those things that is still very important, I think, is adding that distinction to our institution. And then finally, I really feel like there's greater development potential in having a better articulated plan. Having a plan that is clearly developed makes it much easier for folks outside of the library who may have contact with donors. One of the things I think is very important is working with your development officer. It's not by accident that we asked our development officer to serve on the assessment team, because they're a very key player in the whole process. And it is a two-way street with development. You have to know, the development officer has to understand the implications of what it means when you bring in a labor-intensive special collections, but then they have contacts that you as a curator or archivist may not have contacts for. So again, having that clear collecting policy really also helps with that part of the development. So to conclude, I'll circle back to my definition of special collections once again to emphasize that collections are really the collections themselves are really only one part of the equation for success. We still need to have progressive services and support to make the program successful and to maximize impact for the overall library and campus. Thank you very much.